Welcome to our class, the Episcopal Church and You. I'm Eric Williams. I'm the rector of St. Philip's Church, and I'm glad to welcome you to this series. We are now already at our sixth episode, and this is called the Episcopal Church and Structure and Polity. Sounds boring, but I hope in the next 45 minutes to an hour to share with you why it's not so boring, but rather a really important way that we exist and share our faith in this Episcopal branch of the Jesus movement, as our presiding bishop calls it. I'm going to share my screen now, and as I do, I'm going to remind you that this class also takes place in person on Thursday nights once a month. And if you'd like to join us for any of the upcoming sessions, you are very welcome to. So the Episcopal Church and Structure and Polity, episode 6, we've been looking at all kinds of aspects of the Episcopal Church over the past several months, looking at scripture and theology and history. And now we get into how the church is actually organized. That's what structure and polity means. Polity is our sort of political organization, how power and authority is managed within the church, and then how it's structured. So if you have questions, I have my email at the end. You're welcome to reach out to me or catch me if you're a St. Philip's person, catch me in church and ask me there. Happy to respond to you. So let's go back in time. What was leadership? What was the structure of the church at the very beginning, at the time of the apostles? As far as we can tell, and I'm going to cover this in very broad strokes, church historians will probably take some umbrage with my generalizations, but I want to give you kind of a flavor of what structure and leadership was like in the early church. In Ephesians chapter 4, Paul mentions that the risen Christ has given leaders to the church, including these categories: apostles, prophets, and evangelists. We believe that St. Paul was one of the earliest communicators of Christian faith and structure, and so we take seriously what he had to say about that. Some of the later epistles, 1 Timothy and Titus, mention bishops, that there are bishops or overseers. That's the word. Episcope means overseer. And they list the qualifications for bishops, which are kind of interesting to read as well. And then the first order, it's often called, of ordained ministry are deacons, mentioned in Acts chapter 6. The apostles were too busy to do all the work of spreading the gospel and caring for the needs of the poor, and so they appointed 7 men to assist the apostles. The first of them was St. Stephen. That's a much later painting of St. Stephen, who became the first martyr of the church when he was stoned to death for his faith. And then we have the development of another office of ministry, elders or presbyters. That's the Greek word for elder. Paul and Barnabas appointed elders in each church, and according to Acts 14, with prayer and fasting, entrusted them to the Lord in whom they had come to believe. So we don't have a lot of formal structure in the early church. They're just figuring stuff out, right? They're missionaries spreading the good news wherever they can. And structure comes later, once the church becomes more established. And that happens under the Roman Empire. So what's Christianity like under Rome? Well, in those first few centuries, the church, as according to Acts and other sources, was spreading incredibly rapidly from Pentecost through the first few centuries. Christians were being baptized and churches were being planted, but there was no official recognition of them in the Roman Empire. And in fact, there was sporadic times of persecution. We think of the Christians being thrown to the lions in Rome, and it's there's actually not a lot of evidence that a lot of Christians were thrown to lions specifically, but there were times when particular Roman emperors decided that this new Christian group was getting too big, too powerful, and so there were times when their property was taken away, or in fact there were times when there were martyrdoms, killings, imprisonments, and so forth. That all changed on a fateful day in 313, in the Common Era, 313 AD, when the Emperor Constantine, facing an incredibly important battle at the Milvian Bridge, had a vision. And this was in 312, actually. The vision was of the Chi-Rho, the PX that you sometimes see in churches is actually the Greek letters Chi and Rho. And that appeared to him in a vision in the sky, and the voice of God told him, in this sign, conquer. And so Constantine took that as a sign that if he followed Christ, he would be victorious. Well, he was victorious at the Battle of the Milvian Bridge. He united, there were different emperors vying for full control of the Roman Empire. He won, and he became a Christian. He actually waited until his deathbed to be baptized. And I'll go into that at some other time, but suddenly in 313, there was the Edict of Toleration, and Christians were no longer to be persecuted. And then eventually Constantine made Christianity the official religion of the Roman Empire. This was a huge step because up until that time, Rome had allowed many religions to flourish. They basically took an agnostic approach to religion. As long as people paid taxes and honored the emperor, they could be whatever religion they wanted. But now Constantine said, no, Christianity will be the official religion. And that lasts for 150 years or so until the Western Roman Empire. Now, it's complicated, but the Roman Empire had spread all through the world. And in 476 AD, in the Common Era, the was it the Visigoths or the Vandals sacked Rome, and Rome falls, right? The Germanic tribes defeat the Roman Empire, and it lasted a while in other forms, but essentially this was a turning point in Western history because, and that's mostly what we're focusing on, because after this time, the Roman Empire as the governmental authority kind of ceases to exist or is greatly diminished in its authority. So what takes its place, right, for Western Europe in particular? Who's left to maintain society, right? Schools, hospitals, legal documents, all those essential things that we expect government to have a role in. There's no government. There were warring tribes, chieftains. This was the time of, we call it the Dark Ages because there was so much chaos. Well, the church becomes the source of stability. The church is the institution that's really left to uphold these kind of important structures of society. And so the church takes on a lot of the trappings of the Roman Empire. It's kind of interesting that we still talk about the divisions of the Episcopal Church, Roman Catholic Church, as dioceses. Why do we call them dioceses? That was a Roman governmental structure, like counties, right? Instead of counties, you had dioceses, and that's what the church took on. The vestments that Episcopal and Catholic priests wear to this day were essentially what Romans wore around town. The white alb was kind of like a toga, and then these other sort of decorative cloths that were put on top were basically wearing Roman clothes right out of the Roman Empire. We kept those as part of our symbols. So this early period of the Middle Ages, we call the Dark Ages, was a time of great power and growing authority for the church. And so the structure begins to emerge. At that time, there were 5 bishops who were considered the most important. They were called patriarchs, and they occupied the cities that had special significance for the Christian faith. In the West, there was Rome, because Peter and Paul were both martyred in Rome, and so Rome became the center of the West, the government, and also became a center for the church. But it wasn't the only one at this time. There was Constantinople, where the bishop there, the patriarch, considered himself the most important because Constantine moved, it's called Constantinople because Constantine moved his capital to Constantinople. He left Rome and went to Constantinople, and that became the center of civilization in the 4th century. And there were 3 others: Alexandria in Egypt, which is a great center of learning. Think about the library, the Great Library of Alexandria, which sadly burned. There's Antioch, which is the city where Christians were first called Christians. There's Jerusalem, of course, having a kind of pride of place as the city where Jesus was crucified and raised from the dead. So these 5 bishops really were considered sort of equal leaders of this church during the early Middle Ages. But very quickly, in the 6 and 7 and 800s, Islam explodes onto the scene, and Muslim armies quickly take over many of these cities, including Alexandria, Antioch, and Jerusalem. So the only 2 left, the only 2 great bishops left are Rome and Constantinople. And so there's a lot of debate back and forth. Who's in charge? There's a lot of separation. In the East, in Constantinople, they're speaking Greek. Their orientation is more Eastern. And in the West, they're speaking Latin. At that time, Rome was kind of a backwater. It's considered less civilized, less important. But the Bishop of Rome claims to be the most important bishop because of a document that later turned out to be a forgery called the Donation of Constantine, where Constantine supposedly wrote to the Pope, the Bishop of Rome, and said, "I am investing you with all the authority of the Roman Empire." And so bishops of Rome took this to mean that they were more important than Constantinople. This leads to a big fight, the Great Schism of 1054. Actually, to this day, the Eastern Orthodox churches who look to Constantinople and the Roman Catholic and Western Christian churches have not been united since 1054. So long, long fight over authority. In the West, during the Middle Ages, another thing to note is that as the papacy grows in power and authority, it also claims civil as well as religious power. So kings were used to appointing their own bishops. The Pope claims that only the Pope can appoint bishops, and this leads to more controversy and conflict over the structure. All this relates to how the church grows in its structure. We fast forward now, as I mentioned, we're kind of whipping through history here. We fast forward to the Reformation, 1517, Martin Luther. We talked about that in our history class. Well, Protestant churches took a variety of approaches. In Roman Catholicism, the polity or structure remained largely the same, right? The Pope is the most important. Then you have the bishops, the magisterium, you have the priests, and they all have this kind of hierarchical model that's centered in the papacy and in Rome. For Protestants, there were many, many different approaches to church polity. Some abandoned all clergy, all sacraments, and all hierarchy altogether. Basically, they said, no, every Christian can read the Bible and make up their own mind. You think of the Dunkers, which was a sect in Germany, some of the Anabaptists. You think of some of the more radical Protestants who took the approach that all of the hierarchical structure of the Catholic Church was a later addition, and they were trying to go back to a quote unquote pure form of Christianity that they see in the New Testament. And so they took a different approach. And then some took kind of a hybrid approach. Calvin in Switzerland and Geneva, he creates what he hopes to be the city on the hill, right? He wants Geneva to be a perfect society. Finally, we can have a society that's totally based in faith and religion. And it turns into a bloody mess. There's executions and all kinds of problems. Mixing church and politics always has some dire consequences. Well, what about us? The Church of England kept the structure of the Catholic Church, right? Still going to have bishops, priests, still going to have the sacraments, still going to have the liturgy. But the major change was to change who was at the top. So instead of the Pope being the head of the church, now the king or queen is head of the church. That's the major change at the beginning of the Reformation in England. How about America? What's going on when the Anglican Church comes to America. So before the Revolutionary War, there were no bishops in America. All the Anglicans in America were under the authority of the Bishop of London, and he was responsible for sending missionary priests to America to make sure that churches had clergy, sacraments, etc. And so almost all of our clergy were imports from England who didn't stay very long. They stayed a couple of years. The picture on the slide is John Wesley, who famously founds the Methodist Church. He was an Anglican priest, and he was sent to Georgia as a missionary. There were two missionary societies, the Society for the Promotion of Christian Knowledge and the Society for the Propagation of the Gospel. And they sponsored these priests like John Wesley to come and do services in America. Well, the Revolution, of course, caused a huge disruption in this. We talked about this in the history class. What's going to happen? We no longer have the Bishop of London. We no longer have clergy coming over. What is the church going to do? Is it going to go out of business, or is it going to adapt? And it adapts. So here we have the creation of the Episcopal Church. The church in America, this is Bishop William White, who was the first presiding bishop of the Episcopal Church. He simultaneously served as the rector of Christ Church, Philadelphia, and the bishop of Pennsylvania, and the presiding bishop of the Episcopal Church. He had to wear many hats. He also, I believe, had a lot of children. So he was a very busy man. So the new Episcopal Church is going to be separate from the Anglican Church, but it's going to keep a lot of the traditions of Anglicanism, but it's going to adapt them to this new environment in America. And what happens is a weird kind of hybrid of, think of that Catholic tradition of bishops, priests, and deacons, of sacraments, of the hierarchy of the church, which goes all the way back to the Middle Ages. And now we're going to superimpose that on a Republican democracy that is being created in Philadelphia by the founding fathers, and I'm sure there were some founding mothers too, who are creating the structure of American government. So the Episcopal Church is this weird hybrid of Republican democracy wedded to Catholic hierarchy. And we'll talk about how that's a strength, and it can be very confusing at times as well. Some of the same people were going back and forth between the conventions that were creating the Constitution and creating the new Episcopal Church, which is kind of fun to think about. It kept the Catholic Anglican orders of ministry, bishops, priests, and deacons, but as I said, they wedded that to representative democracy. And I think this is really often understated, but it's really important. Think about when the church was in America without their own clergy, right? All the clergy were coming over from England. We had no bishops of our own. We only had the Bishop of London. Well, it then became the custom for hundreds of years until the Revolution that parishes had to be governed largely by lay leaders. This was very different from other places where the Church of England had missionaries. In most of those places, eventually indigenous people were raised up to be the leaders. But in America, we've had a strong tradition of lay leadership from the very beginning. And that persists into the evolution of the church, as we'll see. So let's talk about the governance of the Episcopal Church. How does the thing actually work? And feel free to reach out to me later if you have questions about this. So instead of a pope or a magisterium or something like that deciding what is the ultimate answer on questions of authority, our ultimate authority in the Episcopal Church, well, is Jesus Christ. Let's say that. But sort of politically and how we organize ourselves, the ultimate authority is the General Convention. The General Convention is made up of a house of bishops. So all the bishops, all the active bishops of the Episcopal Church are one house, kind of like the Senate, if you think about the American system of government. And the other house is called the House of Deputies, And this is made up of priests, deacons, and lay people who are all elected by their diocese. And so we'll look at how that works in just a second. But picture this, basically, our system of government in the Episcopal Church is very much like our Congress. There's a House of Bishops and a House of Deputies, and they have to agree on legislation that comes before them for it to become official canon law, basically. And then we chose in America not to have an archbishop. Like in England, there's the Archbishop of Canterbury and the Archbishop of York, who are the two senior bishops. We said, no, that sounds too medieval. That sounds too like nobility and, all the stuff we're trying to get away from in America. And so we decided instead that there would be a presiding bishop, think president, who presides over the House of Bishops and is the kind of head or symbolic head of the Episcopal Church as a whole. So when you hear us talk about or pray for every Sunday, Michael, our presiding bishop, Michael Curry is our current presiding bishop. He serves a term of 9 years. He will be retiring at the end of this next phase. I think in 2024 is our next general convention. COVID threw things off, so we're a year off base, but I believe he retires in 2024 and a new presiding bishop will be elected. One of the House of Bishops who are currently bishops will be elected as the next presiding bishop to serve a 9-year term. Whew. All right, so what about church rules and regulations? So the church has a book of laws, basically. It is called our Constitution and Canons, and it's updated every time there's a general convention with some changes to the Constitution and Canons. And it covers all kinds of stuff. It's adopted by the General Convention. Some changes, like changes to the Constitution, have to be adopted at 2 consecutive General Conventions. So it'll take, 3, 4, 6 years to fully adopt a change to the Constitution. Some canonical changes can be changed at each convention. Each diocese also adopts their own constitution and canons. So we have our national constitution and canons, and then we also have our diocesan constitution and canons. And these things cover all sorts of stuff, like how do clergy get called to a parish? What happens if there's misconduct by a clergy person? What's the process for dealing with misconduct? What kind of reporting? How does a parish become officially a parish if it was a mission? All those kinds of things. Even the kinds of study that seminaries have to provide for clergy, all of that's covered in the Constitution and Canons. How bishops are elected, that's covered in there as well. That kind of thing. It all goes into these books of Constitution and Canons, all the kind of rules and regulations. And then on the local level, each congregation also adopts its own bylaws. So a few years ago, our current senior warden, Jen Hatchett, led us in a process to update our bylaws, partly because we realized there were some things we had to clean up to deal with how we were doing things during the pandemic. Like no one foresaw what we were going to have to do as far as worship or meetings. Like, could we have virtual meetings? Well, there was no provision for Zoom meetings in the old bylaws. So a lot of times the Constitution and Canons and the bylaws change because of the evolution of circumstances that we didn't predict 100 years ago. And so we adapt and we vote on those changes. And that's what we did a few years ago. And these rules and regulations, as I mentioned, govern how we choose and train clergy, parishes organized, misconduct, and so forth. So I want to show you a few charts now that kind of, for me, if you're a visual person, hopefully this will help you. So as I mentioned, we have this weird hybrid between the hierarchical Catholic structure of bishops, priests, and deacons, sort of top down, authority comes from the top and then comes down. And we wedded that to the representative democracy of the United States of America. So I want you to think about ultimately authority. Where does authority come from? we strive the best we can to be obedient, to listen to the voice of God, to read the scriptures, to interpret them, and to act in accordance with God's will. And we do that in community. It's not just the presiding bishop who does that and then tells us what to think. That happens by all of the people of the church. So in this, you see that the key for us as far as authority is authority really does not flow from top down, but it really flows from the bottom up. We believe as Episcopalians that the authority that comes to us from God comes to the people of God by virtue of their baptism. The most important sacrament for receiving authority from God is baptism, not ordination. I have no greater authority in that sense than any other baptized member of the church. And so that is reflected in our structure and polity, in that when we are electing leaders, it is the members of the parish. So January 29th of this year, we had our annual meeting. And at that meeting, the members of the church voted for the leaders of the church, who are the vestry. So that baptismal authority starts with the people, and then they choose representatives. That's why we're a representative democracy, not a direct democracy. We don't decide everything in a congregational meeting. We elect a vestry who make the key decisions on our behalf. And so that's what this chart is about. Then the vestry elects their wardens, who are the senior warden, who helps oversee the overall ministry of the church, and the junior warden, whose job is mainly to oversee property, buildings, and grounds. And interestingly, it's the vestry that calls a rector. When you're interviewing for a rector, you don't have an interview with the whole church. It's the vestry. Usually there's a search committee, and then the search committee recommends someone to the vestry, but it is the vestry that calls a new priest. And so even that task is really, the bishop doesn't appoint a priest. It is an election, it's a decision by the vestry of the church. Again, that's how that authority comes from the bottom up. Moving up in our structure, so we have our parishes, kind of you can see over here, and we've elected our vestry, and we've elected our wardens, and we've chosen our priest. We also, at our annual meeting, we elect people from the parish who serve at the diocesan convention. So, and I'll show you where our diocese is in a second, but the diocesan convention is that structure that decides things for the diocese. So the delegates from our parish who are chosen are going to go to Novi in October, and they're going to sit through a day and a half of meetings, and they are going to vote on the various proposals, adopt the diocesan budget, and so forth. A few years ago, our delegates got to go to a special convention that elected our bishop. So again, our bishop wasn't appointed by a pope or someone else. Our bishop was selected by the members of the diocese, by lay people and clergy who came from parishes to a meeting. And I was part of the search committee. The search committee had selected 4 finalists. And then from those 4 finalists, the whole diocesan convention, lay people, clergy, and so forth, got to elect their next bishop, and they chose Bonnie. The diocesan convention cannot meet all the time, right? It's just a day and a half. So in between those conventions, there are key committees that carry on the work of the diocese in between conventions. And those include a standing committee, which deals with issues of ordination and of property and of misconduct, that kind of thing. Basically, it's a council of advice for the bishop. And there are lay people and clergy on that. So convention elects people to serve on standing committee, 4 lay people and 4 clergy, so it's balanced. A diocesan council is kind of like the vestry of the diocese. So diocesan council has members from all the different deaneries. I'll talk about that. Those are smaller subdivisions of the diocese, and they work on the policies and ministries of the diocese in between conventions. And then the trustees also are elected, and they oversee the investments and property of the diocese. Finally, at the diocesan convention every 3 years, members of the convention elect deputies who go to the general convention. Remember, I mentioned general convention is the most important body for the Episcopal Church. Well, it's members of parishes who elect delegates to the diocese who elect the deputies to general convention. So authority comes from parishes, the members of parishes, to the diocese, to the national church. So you too could be a delegate to diocesan convention or even a deputy to general convention. And I encourage you, if you are interested, to participate in the structure of the church in that way. A lot of people have told me everyone should go to diocesan convention once. And when general convention is in reach of a drive, it's worth visiting because it's fun to see all the displays and to see the church at work in that way. So here's the general convention, right? Those deputies that are elected at the diocese, they go to the general convention. And as I mentioned, there's the House of Bishops, so all the bishops are there, and the presiding bishop runs that meeting. And then there's the House of Deputies, which is the lay people, priests and deacons who are elected, and they have a president of the House of Deputies who alternates between a lay person and a clergy person. So we currently, I believe, have a lay person as the president of the House of Deputies. And the one who just stepped down was a priest from the Diocese of Ohio. So, and as I mentioned, at General Convention, these two houses have to agree on all legislation. So some things start off in the House of Bishops, like changes to worship, and then they have to be adopted by the deputies with some revisions. There are committees that go back and forth, just like Congress, to make sure that the wording gets adopted in the same way by both. But that's how it works. Every 3 years, except this last time because of COVID, every 3 years, the General Convention is working on all those things. So pause just to let that sink in for a second. So when I mention these different dioceses and so forth, what am I talking about? So essentially, there are about 100 dioceses that make up the Episcopal Church. And they are spread out across the United States. And they also include dioceses like Haiti in the Caribbean. I believe Puerto Rico might now be part of the Episcopal Church. There are American Episcopal churches in Europe. They comprise their own diocese, and so forth. You get the idea. So it's not just the United States of America, mostly, but not only the United States of America. It includes Alaska and Hawaii. So the church is kind of broken up into provinces. There are 9 provinces of the Episcopal Church, and you can see how they're kind of spread out here. So province 1 is New England, province 2, New York, New Jersey, and the churches in Europe. Province 3, the sort of mid-Atlantic states. Province 4, the Southeast. 5 is us, the Midwest, the sort of Eastern Midwest. You get province 6, which is kind of the Upper Plains states. Province 7, the Southern Texas and other states. And then the West is province 8. And then province 9 are those churches in the Caribbean and other places that make up the non-geographical U.S. dioceses. So who's in our province? Province 5, which is us, includes Michigan. In the state of Michigan, we actually have 4 dioceses. We have Western Michigan, which is basically everything kind of west of 75. Northern Michigan, which is that interesting part of Michigan, which looks like it's more part of Wisconsin. And Northern Michigan's an interesting diocese because their structure is totally different. They are an exclusively rural diocese. And so they adopted a whole different way of doing ministry. I mean, you think of St. Philip's, I went away to a 3-year seminary. I am a full-time paid employee of the church. I was called here to do a certain kind of job here. Well, in Northern Michigan, they couldn't make that work. There weren't enough priests, and the parishes couldn't afford to have full-time priests. And so they adopted something called total ministry or baptismal ministry, where members of a church would divvy up all the different ministries of the church. It kind of like the New Testament, Paul talking about all the different ministries. And then different people would take on those roles as volunteers. So you'd have a volunteer who stands up at the altar and does the Eucharistic prayer, another volunteer who stands up and gives a sermon, another volunteer who does Sunday school, another volunteer who's the secretary, another volunteer who does education, and so forth. And so the idea is that everybody takes their part in the ministry of the church. And Northern Michigan's really been an example of how that model can work, particularly in rural areas. Eastern Michigan is interesting. That's basically the thumb. And they are the most recent diocese in Province 5 because they were tired. They were part of the Diocese of Michigan, which is us, right? So Southeast Michigan, it's called Michigan, which I'm sure the other dioceses don't like. We get the actual name of the state. They get regional names. But they were all part of Michigan up in the thumb. But they got this feeling that nothing was ever being done up in their area, right? There weren't meetings in Saginaw. All the meetings seemed to be in Detroit. That's where the cathedral was. That's where the bishop's office was. They felt kind of neglected. And so after a long time of stewing about it, they had a proposal to create their own diocese. So essentially now, Rochester or Lake Orion or maybe Romeo are the last parishes in the northern part of Michigan. Everything above us is Eastern Michigan. So if you go up to Flint, let's say, or Grand Blanc or someplace, that's all going to be the Diocese of Eastern Michigan. So, and you can see they also include, we won't talk about the state or diocese to the south of us, but you see how it all shakes out. And so the provinces will occasionally meet in between general conventions. There'll be gatherings of Province 5 because the issues that relate to Episcopalians in this region are worth kind of exploring. So if we think about the layers of structure, there's the Episcopal Church as a whole, kind of the national or international body of the Episcopal Church. Then there's the province, which is this cluster of dioceses. Then there is each diocese. So here's our Diocese of Michigan, just the southeast corner. Then there's another structure called the deanery. So within our diocese, there are groupings of parishes that meet together for the common good from time to time. So our deanery is called the McGee Deanery after former Bishop Coleman McGee, and it includes parishes largely in Oakland County. So I think Royal Oak is the furthest south in our deanery, Birmingham, Christchurch, Cranbrook, Southfield, Lake Orion, and so forth and Troy are all part of our deanery. And we have clergy gatherings, we have gatherings of lay people from time to time, and then the parish. So that's kind of all the layers of structure within the Episcopal Church. When we look beyond the Episcopal Church, we have what's called the Anglican Communion. So the Anglican Communion is the association of all those churches that have their origin in the Church of England. You may be surprised, we're a very small denomination in America, but when you add up all the Anglicans around the world, we're the third largest Christian communion. Roman Catholics are number 1, Eastern Orthodox are number 2, And Anglicans are number 3 at about 85 million members. So we are, as I said, made up of all the what are now independent churches that were once missionary outposts of the Church of England. So we all have a common heritage and roots in the Church of England. So there are 4 kind of structures within the Anglican Communion that keep the Anglican Communion kind of together. I'll talk about that. It's been a little bit stressed of late over issues of human sexuality and other things. But the 4 instruments of unity or of communion are, 1, the Archbishop of Canterbury. So here he is. Our current Archbishop of Canterbury is Justin Welby. Here he's having a nice moment with Pope Francis. He is kind of the figurehead of the whole Anglican Communion. He's the Archbishop of Canterbury, so he actually has a diocese in Canterbury, and he's the head of the Church of England, so he has specific responsibilities. But in addition, he also serves as kind of the titular head of this whole Anglican Communion. Second, he gathers together about every 10 years, it varies, but around then, a conference of all the Anglican bishops from around the world called the Lambeth Conference. And because Lambeth Palace is where his house and office are. So even though his cathedral is in Canterbury, but Lambeth is just across from London, across the Thames. So that's where his kind of office is. And so that conference meets about every 10 years. And it's really for fellowship, for sharing of needs and concerns, and a place to argue about the issues of the day. There's also, and I hope you don't laugh, it is kind of funny, the heads of each of the provinces of the Anglican Communion are called primates, not primates, right? They're not apes, but they are primates, the prime, like the first among equals. So the head of the Episcopal Church, our presiding bishop, is the primate of the Episcopal Church, and he goes to meetings with the other primates, the head of the Anglican Church of Uganda, the head of the Anglican Church of Australia and New Zealand and Canada. All those primates gather for meetings as well. And finally, there is the Anglican Consultative Council, which is a group of, I believe, lay people and clergy that works on statements and theological propositions. So those are the 4 ways that the Anglican Communion talks together and works together. As I mentioned, there's been a lot of tension over particularly women's ordination and human sexuality. And so churches in the global South, particularly those in Africa and Latin America and parts of Asia, were essentially horrified that churches in America and Canada and New Zealand, even though they're in the South, began to ordain women first, and then began to ordain openly gay and lesbian priests, and then bishops. And so that's led to a lot of friction within the Anglican Communion. And so part of Justin Welby's job is to figure out how the church can stay together as a communion. Now, there's nothing legislatively that holds them together. It's really a gathering of friendship and common roots. But still, some would like to see the Anglican Communion be all of one mind on these issues. And for now, that is not the case. So that was a whirlwind tour through the structure and polity of the Episcopal Church. I am sure that you have some questions about how this all works. I will just offer a few comments about St. Philip. So our structure, as I mentioned, we have elected vestry. Our vestry meets typically on the 3rd Tuesday of the month at 6:30. If you ever have an issue you'd like to bring to the vestry, contact me or Jen Hatchett, who is our senior warden, and we can make sure to put something on the agenda for you. We do want this to be a church that truly represents your beliefs, your desires, your opinions, your thoughts. And so the vestry wants to be responsive to you the best that we can. And I urge you to be in touch if there are things you're thinking about. And I urge you to get involved in ministries at the church. I urge you to get involved, if you'd like, in ministries and programs at the diocese. They're always offering classes and workshops. There's a ministry fair coming up this spring that'll be excellent. Training for different types of ministry. So all of that is available to you as a part of the Episcopal Church, as a member of St. Philip's, as a part of the Diocese of Michigan, the Province 5 of the Episcopal Church in the United States of America. I'm really grateful to be part of this structure, and I hope you are too. And if you have thoughts, questions, or want to find out more, please do reach out to me whenever you get a chance. And a little plug, next month, April 13th, our topic will be social issues and society. How has the Episcopal Church grappled with the issues of the day from the earliest times through, headlines ripped from the newspaper? So be sure to join us for that class. It'll be in person on April 13th, and I will try to upload it to YouTube on that day or maybe a day or two before that. In the meantime, God bless you and have a wonderful day.